Welcome back, everyone. I hope you're all doing well. Once again, before we start, please join me in prayer. Good afternoon, Heavenly Parent and True Parents. We're here again for Joining the Dots. We're getting towards the end of this workshop now, so I pray we can really make the most of this precious time we have together. We want to invite you once again to be here with us as we study together, learn together, discuss together. And yeah, we want to offer this now and invite you here. On behalf of everyone here, I pray this in my name, so my daughter of the Blessed Central Family, Arju.
So good evening, everyone. It's nice to see you all here again. Thanks for sticking with us for 3 weeks, and I wasn't quite sure if I was going to make it to the end myself. So I'm really happy and grateful that you were able to. It's been quite an adventure for me, and just 2 days to go. I thought I wouldn't have enough to say, but to be honest, I probably could have gone another week. All right, so we'll carry on from where we were yesterday. So what we've been looking at then, the last few days, is like a narrative account of biblical political philosophy, or the philosophy of politics as it's revealed in the Bible. And as I was showing you there, it's very much a narrative account. It's not like Enlightenment books on political philosophy. It's not like the regular kind of book on political philosophy that you would pick up, you would read, which is generally speaking almost entirely very, very abstract and not really connected to real life or the real life of real people with real historical examples. But anyway, so that we looked at the biblical account. But then the interesting thing about the principle also, it follows a narrative structure. And whenever you listen to Father speaking, you always start with Adam and Eve, and he's worked his way through the Old Testament or characters in the Hebrew Bible, and then through to Jesus, and and then sometimes he worked his way a little bit through European history, and I spent a lot of time also talking about American history as God's providence. So Father's understanding of God's providence is also a narrative, and also the understanding of political philosophy is a narrative one as well. And so we see that, often we might have heard lectures on the history parallels. Unfortunately, the way this is usually taught is to try to prove that the Messiah is born between 1917 and 1930. And people usually just rush through showing the parallels. Actually, there's a lot more going on than that. Unfortunately, I don't have time to go into it. But what I did want to do is to pick up the development of the Abel-type Judeo-Christian liberal democratic tradition. And before that, somebody was asking me yesterday a bit about Headwing. So, where is Headwing here? And as I said, I find this kind of scheme very, very unsatisfactory. It's a scheme produced by particular people for a particular agenda, and which is basically to make people anti-right-wing. So right-wing now is like a swear word. If someone calls you right-wing, they're basically calling you a Nazi and a fascist. And, the further you go this way, the more like a Nazi or fascist you are. Whereas if you're this end of the spectrum, you're good by definition, because you're a socialist, you're loving, you're caring, it's compassionate and everything else. So as I said, this is a much more accurate way of depicting or describing the political spectrum, from less free to more free. At this end here, you have the fascism and communism, and the kind of societies that were created by these people who were, as I mentioned, very idealistic people who were very compassionate and wanted to create a good society, their vision of a good society. And I talked a lot about that, how the roots of fascism and communism, both of them lie in Platonic political philosophy, the pyramid, feudalism, top down, etc., etc. One bloke at the top directing, ordering everybody about, and an imposed order upon society, whether it's fascist and authoritarian, or whether it's communist and totalitarian and a planned society. And the other end of the spectrum, then we have absolute liberty, anarchy, people just doing anything they want, completely uncontrolled. And then here, is basically, I would say, this is where the head wing is, somewhere around here, way of ordered liberty. Okay, so let's have a look. So, thinking about it last night, as I said, as somebody asked me a question, I thought, well, how can we try to draw together, some of the dots a little bit more? So going right back to the very beginning there, we were looking at order and chaos with Pythagoras, and Pythagoras identified order with good and chaos with evil. And then we looked how, what's his name? Gordon Peterson identified the masculine with order, and extreme masculinity leads to authoritarianism. And it also talked about feminine, also connected to chaos and the appearance of new things. And we can see here, this side here, you've got, in terms of politics, you've got totalitarianism, authoritarianism, the imposition of order. And this extreme here, you get anarchy and lawlessness and complete disorder. Here, the emphasis on collectivism. Here, the emphasis on individualism. Within the principle, again, I talked about this balance between the purpose of the whole and the purpose of the individual. That is headwing, when you get the purpose of the whole and the purpose of the individual in balance, where one fulfills the other, and you can't have one purpose being fulfilled without the other purpose being fulfilled. That's really the headwing vision. But anyway, most of human society has emphasized either one or the other. And so here we saw Noah's time, there was chaos, there was anarchy, there was just violence everywhere because there was no government, there was no law, there was no justice. And the response to that was Nimrod, the Tower of Babel, a totalitarian imperialistic society where orders imposed through force. And that, went on into Egypt, slavery, and all the sort of societies which are like that. Most recently in our lifetime, basic communism. And what you see going on in North Korea is and also in China, but North Korea is probably the perfection of this kind of thing. Okay, and then here we saw Noah's time. Well, another attempt, the period of the judges, and in the modern world, we talk about failed states where there's complete disorder and it's just run by gangs. And so I would say the headwing then, which is sort of why I stuck it all here in the middle, it's freedom, which means not free, but freedom, which I talked about. It's a combination of free and law, so it's ordered liberty. So people are free within the framework of law to pursue beauty, truth, and goodness. So that was a vision from the very beginning of the Bible. Then the Noah's Code, or those 7 laws, and also we looked at the development of Hebrew society, the Israelites, the 10 Commandments, etc. The kind of vision of freedom created by law, ordered liberty. And so it's a rule and not a command-based society. So this kind of society here is command-based. You have to follow orders. There's somebody at the top ordering everybody around, telling everybody what they can do, where they should work, how they should live. So a headwing society is a rule-based society, like what was being accomplished at Mount Sinai, trying to create a society based upon law, based upon simple rules, which created space for people to pursue beauty, truth, and goodness, and be creative, really. As I said, that's the Noahide covenant. So here you have self-organization within these rules. So again, if you look back at that, if you remember that video, which we looked at, Secret Life of Chaos, it's the same kind of idea that there is order within chaos. So we look at the state of the natural world. Within the natural world, everything has an inherent direction of nature, moving towards greater and greater levels of complexity. And that's not just at the level of particles, atoms, and molecules, it's also at the level of human society as well. You have self-organization within the rules. So when you have a rule-based society, then within that, then people develop all sorts of complex institutions and things like that without being designed. And so you have then order within chaos. And so headwing is like a limited government. So the main function of the king and government is to defend the country. Defending the country, well, that's to defend the way of life of the people. So there's no violence by somebody coming along, invading and stealing their country from them. Also to uphold justice, so that criminals who go around stealing and doing nasty stuff as well get punished, put into prison. And limited government then, as I talked about, headwing is separation of functions, again, going all the way back to the biblical tradition of prophet, priest, and king, and executive, legislature, and judiciary, separation of functions there. And so, important thing here, which is saw from the period of the Judges, it's necessary to have government, otherwise there's chaos. But it's very different to the Plato's one, where the state is a source of people, the state is a source of law, the state is a source of people's identity, people effectively have to worship the state. The state, it becomes sacred. There's nothing higher than the state. So that was the dominant tradition which you saw from Plato, through the Greeks, through the Romans, and that has been the dominant tradition on the continent of Europe up until today, I would say. So what we're talking about here, the head wing, is just a functional state, not one that people are supposed to obey, not one that people are supposed to get their identity from, just a state which upholds, defends the country, has a good army or whatever, and upholds the law, so it has an independent police force and, builds the roads and that sort of thing. But pretty much the rest would be done elsewhere, which I'll talk about tomorrow, I think. And so here then, this vision of a head-wing society is the biblical vision of God dwelling in the individual, God dwelling in the family through the Sabbath, and God dwelling in the society. As God said, if you build a tabernacle, I'll dwell and live among you. So this is how I understand it. It's neither all the way over here, nor is it all the way over here. It's a synthesis and harmonization of the purpose of the whole and the purpose of the individual. Where people are living according to their conscience. So they're helping others, getting involved with each other's, cooperating, supporting each other's, not because they're ordered to do so, but because their heart moves them to do that. It's a spontaneous order, very much bottom going up. Okay, so that was my little reflections on this afternoon. So let's see where we go next. So what I want to do then is look at this sort of narrative, and just going back to the Divine Principle book, the able democratic tradition. It says, from the very origins, the democracies which emerged in England and the United States are very different from the democracy born out of the French Revolution. And from the French Revolution, we have that became the inspiration, the pattern for the Russian Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, all the stuff that happened there. The latter is a Kane-type democracy founded by atheists and materialists who are raised in the Kane-type view of life as attempted to dismantle absolutism and feudalism. Atheists and materialists, but also, as I said, the main source of inspiration was a rationalist inspiration, and going all the way back to Plato, this vision of a planned society, etc., etc. The English and American democracies, on the other hand, were founded by sincere Christians. The fruits of the able-type view of life were born out of their victorious fight with absolutism to win religious freedom, which is, this is part of the story. I'll explain. This is like a summary. Okay, so these are the able-type democracies. So let's have a look then at how the able-type democracy developed. Most of the time I spent looking at Europe, looking at the Kane-type tradition, Plato, fascism, communism. So I'd like to have a look within Europe a little bit about the good side. Okay, so this is Britain, or most of it. And Britain was also conquered by the Roman Empire. It was integrated into the Roman Empire for about 450 years, I guess. And it left a lasting cultural imprint, not just on the geography or the straight roads, which you can see there, but it left a lasting cultural imprint upon things like law and lots of other things as well. And I'm telling you, when you cross this border here, then you realize the Romans didn't get that far, because there's a cultural shift when you cross over that area there. I lived in Inverness for about a year and a half and traveled all over the Highlands and Islands and experienced a lot of stuff there. So late Rome then, it was a totalitarian society. There was no religious, social, economic freedom. No religious freedom. Why not? Because the Emperor Theodosius, he decided to make Christianity the official religion of Rome. This was a disaster, because when Christianity became the official religion of Rome, it meant that there's no longer any religious freedom. All the academies and the non-Christian schools and seminaries were all closed down. And also people had to believe and conform to the Nicene Creed. If they didn't do that, they were regarded as being a heretic, and they had to leave their empire, or they could be subjected to persecution. There was also a lot of anti-Semitic legislation was put on the statute book from the time of Constantine as well. So that's why the Roman Empire lost the foundation to receive the Messiah, because if Messiah had been born in the Roman Empire, he would have been put to death, because he wouldn't have subscribed to the Nicene Creed. So, as I said, late Rome became totalitarian, no religious social freedom, no social freedom or economic freedom. It's a planned society, and all about power, basically, the imposition of power, the imposition of order. Very much like that. The whole Roman tradition is like that. So anyway, during this time, there's an interesting little thing called the Glastonbury Legends. I don't know if any of you heard this song by William Blake, and did Jerusalem and did those feet in ancient times, walk upon England's pastures green. Anyway, this is Glastonbury here, Glastonbury Abbey. There's a legend here that Jesus visited Britain with his uncle, the tin trader, Joseph of Arimathea. And he's supposed to have stayed here and built a little house over here, and visited several times, and maybe studied at the Druid seminaries, because the Druids were a very spiritual community within Britain at that time, and the Romans didn't like them, which is the main reason, one of the main reasons they invaded Britain, because they kept leading to lots of uprising and Gaul. And then after the crucifixion, then the tradition is that Joseph of Arimathea, he returned to Glastonbury with the Holy Grail and buried it somewhere there. And you have all these legends of Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. So the main point I wanted to make here is that the tradition is that Christianity came to Britain very, very early. It didn't come here from Roman missionaries, from the Roman Catholic Church, but it's planted actually by Joseph of Arimathea and developed that way, Celtic Church. Anyway, so let's see what happened a bit later with the fall of Rome. So you have these different patriarchates, and then coming in from the east, there's the Huns or the Hans. People like to talk about the Han tribe, always pushing in from the east, and everybody gets shoved over. And so as the Huns came along, the Germanic tribes got shoved over, and the Celts got shoved over, and everybody got shoved over. And there wasn't much space, and so quite a few people from the Angles and Saxons and Jutes living around here, they decided, well, there's not much space, we're all getting squashed, let's migrate and let's go and settle in Britain. And then they became Christianized, and they sent missionaries back to Christianize the Germanic tribes. And in the principle it says, God raised up the Germanic tribes as a new chosen people. As I said, that was after the failure of the Roman Empire. So when you actually look at this, the Germanic tribes at that stage, they never got to the state of being a nation or having a state or a government. There was tribes, and it's very bottom up, very decentralized. And generally, the Germanic tradition till today, despite a few blips, has been democratic and decentralized. With today in Germany, you've got all the different landers and all that sort of thing. Always had that kind of democratic, decentralized kind of tradition. But as I said, apart from a few times it went wrong. Anyway, so these Germanic tribes, these Angles and Saxons, they moved over to Britain and they settled here. And they were freeholders. So that meant they owned the land in their own right, if they were farmers. And they would live in villages sometimes at a village moot, which is like a self-government, where they'd meet together, they would talk about things, about traditions and customs and all these things. And out of every 100 villages, they would have their own larger scale meeting where they send elected representatives. And then amongst them, they'd have a larger meeting still, which is called the level of the Shire. So these are the modern counties. And then at a larger level still, there'd be something called the Wittenagemot, which was like a parliament where representatives would go from all over the country, and the Wittenagemot would elect the king or depose the king. And freedom then was a very important word, as I mentioned before. This word was coined by Alfred the Great, I think I mentioned that, and it sort of embodies that kind of political philosophy. It's translating the Bible, the Psalms from Hebrew or Greek into English, and coined that term. Law was customary, and already there's trial by jury. So this is the English political culture, English Anglo-Saxon political culture. The English system of government worked from below upwards, from the free man to the king, every man holding his own land as his right, choosing his own ealdorman, who in turn helped to choose the king. Okay, so that's important. The king was not he was elected. And then after the king died, then the Witenagemot would decide, okay, who should become the next king. They found it much easier if they chose it from amongst the existing king's family, but amongst the existing king's sons, they would choose the one who they thought was the most suitable to become the next king. The law was customary law, which formed the basis of common law, which is a body of general rules prescribing social conduct. That's still the basis of English law today as common law, which were later enforced by the ordinary courts and characterized by the development of its own principles in actual legal controversies, by the procedure of trial by jury, and by the doctrine of supremacy of law. This is an important point. The law was not made, but it was discovered. And I talked about that yesterday, I think, or the day before. It was based on custom immemorial. It was God's law, and had been handed down through custom from generation to generation. So as I said, there was a Christian foundation to a lot of this, and they sensed this is God's law. Therefore, nobody has the authority to change it. Passed on from generation to generation. Thus, no one has the authority to unilaterally go against the wisdom of the past generations and make new laws. And the king himself never had the authority to make new laws. The job of the king was merely to uphold the law, not to create it, not to make it, not to change it, but just to uphold and enforce the law, which was there to protect the way of life of the people, and protect their property, protect their livelihoods, protect their houses, their lives, and all these different things. That was what the law was there for. So that carried on for a while, and then there was something called Norman Conquest. So when a Norman from Normandy, it's a sort of northern part of France, called William the Conqueror, which is the polite name for him, he had his eye upon England, and it was a very rich country, and he wanted to go and conquer it and steal it. And so he persuaded the Pope to give him the authority to go and invade England. And so basically the Norman Conquest was a holy war. The Pope, why did he do this? Because the Pope wanted to have more control over the English church. Because as I said, the origins of the English church did not lie in Rome. And so the English always thought that they didn't need to do what the Pope told them to do. So the Pope then, he wanted to have much more control over the Anglo-Saxon church. So he gave William the Conqueror the authority to go and invade England. He conquered England, and all the land then became the property of the crown. So basically he stole the country, conquered it and stole it. So even till today, all the land in England is a legal property of the Queen, of the crown. Not her personally, it all belongs to the crown. And along with that then, he had absolute authority, so he parceled the land up and he redistributed it amongst his knights who'd all joined in. And he said, you know, if you join me, I'll go and we win, then I'll give you all lots of land. So that was the basis. Yeah, it's like a criminal gang. Seized the country, divided the country up, and that's the way it was. And imposed feudalism. So all the Anglo-Saxons who owned the land, they're all dispossessed of their land. Anybody who objected was treated really seriously, badly. Something called the harrying of the north, the desolation of the north of England by people who didn't want to go along with that. Anyway, then for 200 years, the ruling class in England spoke French. They built castles to protect themselves, to impose order. They weren't in their castles, they'd had their throats slit. And the Normans then, they're very, very militaristic. And then they went on to want to conquer Scotland and Wales and Ireland and elsewhere. Okay, so the English then, Anglo-Saxons weren't terribly pleased about this. And so there's gradually, over the next 1,000 years, basically, there's a pushback from the Anglo-Saxons to the English. And so a few hundred years later, something called the Constitution of Clarendon, where the church is put under the law of the land. Okay, this is a pushback against the Pope, wanting to control the church, and but the king wanted the church to be under English law. So that if a priest murdered somebody, he would be tried in the king's court and not in the church court, where he would just have his wrist slapped, told to say 10 Hail Marys, and allowed to go free. Thomas à Becket objected to this, and so he got killed. Then you had the reintroduction of, crystallization of, we want to have trial by jury. That's, basically this pushback to go back to the old laws of Edward the Confessor. And then the barons who got fed up with the king, who was King John. He wanted to go around trampling on people's rights and ignoring the law, and he thought, I'm the king, I can do whatever I want. And so the barons got rather fed up with this, and so they ganged up with it on him, and they forced him to sign what's called a Magna Carta. It's over here. It was drafted by the Archbishop Stephen Langton, and so he drafted this very advanced political document, which had things like this: no person shall be imprisoned, deprived of his property, or outlawed, but by the judgment of his equals or by the law of the land. That meant just because somebody annoyed the king couldn't have him put in prison. He had to be put in prison if he had broken the law. But the king didn't have the authority to decide whether he'd broken the law or not. That was decided by his equals, by jury. And so this then created freedom, yeah? Because it meant that you might annoy a really powerful person, but he cannot put you into prison or steal your property or anything or make you an outlaw without the judgment of his equals, without a trial by jury. So it wasn't the king who was deciding whether you're guilty or not, it was your equals. A really important principle there. And so from here then you start to have the sort of recovery of this democratic tradition. So you might wonder, what's democracy? Name goes back to the Greeks, but anyway, this is generally, anyway, the issues with that. Democracy is a name given to a number of forms of government and procedures which have legitimacy because they have consent of the people they govern. This is really important. The government is perceived to be legitimate because it has the consent of the people they govern. So this again goes all the way back to Mount Sinai, goes all the way back to Samuel and Saul, etc., etc. The two main criteria for democracy are, firstly, the officials exercising power have legitimate authority. Yeah, they have legitimate authority because they've been elected. Yeah. Okay, so this is the point. Okay, you have a legitimate authority because you've been elected. Therefore, you have the authority to do what you're doing, as opposed to inheriting that authority or holding it by force. Okay, so there's a variety of kinds of legitimate authority. There is inherited authority, which is legitimate. So, for example, the Queen of England, she's not elected. Her authority doesn't rest on being elected democratically, but she is regarded as having legitimate authority because she is the eldest daughter of the previous king. That's where authority lies. And so it's people say, yeah, that's legitimate, that you should be the queen as opposed to anybody else. Yeah, or holding it by force. So again, holding it by force is when somebody seizes power in a coup d'etat. Yeah, that is not legitimate authority, it's just force. Secondly, it's a mechanism for changing government or making decisions through peaceful and regular elections. So supposing you do have a terrible king or you do have a terrible government, what are you going to do? Well, the great thing about democracy is every 4 or 5 or however many years it is, you have the opportunity to elect somebody else, an alternative. Yeah? So it means you can get a change of government without having to have a revolt, without having to have a coup, or worst of all, without having to have a civil war. It's just a peaceful transfer of power, and it's regarded as a legitimate way in which power and government is transferred from one person, one party to another. Democracy is not a theory about the aims or content of government, or law should be, only that those aims should be guided by the opinion of the majority as opposed to a single ruler, as with an absolute monarchy, dictatorship, or oligarchy. Just because a government has been democratically elected does not mean it'll be good, just, or competent. Thus, some polities have used democratic process to secure liberty, while others have used it to promote equality, nationalism, or tyranny. So just because a country is democratic, it doesn't mean it's going to be free. It may just so happen that people decide to elect a demagogue. They may decide to elect somebody who becomes a dictator, who promises that he will impose order upon the chaos. Yeah? There are many dictators who are very, very popular and come to power through partly misusing the democratic process. It's possible for a country to go communist because people could elect a communist party. Yeah? So it's just a way of making decisions. So yeah, as I said, a way of making decisions about who will have a particular position or what policy to adopt. So you have a discussion, a debate, and okay, there's a position that's vacant. How will we decide who's going to have that position? Well, let's vote on it. And the person who gets the most votes for whatever reason, maybe the most popular or perceived to be the most qualified or most capable, that's the one who should get the position. And again, before people make these kind of votes, they should think seriously about the person they're voting and whether he really is qualified and what kind of job he's going to do, not just about whether he is popular. And also, you know, if you have to choose between two policies, again, another way to settle this kind of argument is to have a vote. Another way to settle the argument is to take out guns and knives and kill the other people. Yeah, that's like a coup. That's through the use of force. So democracy is a way of resolving these kind of debates, discussions, arguments peacefully. Yeah, that's the main point, without violence. Okay, so we start to see the emergence then of democracy within Britain, or the re-emergence from the Anglo-Saxon period. So it had something called the Provisions of Oxford. And so the king, generally speaking, kings don't like parliaments because they just want to rule with absolute authority. But, you know, from the time quite early on, the English wouldn't go along with this, and they started refusing to cooperate with this. They wanted to have parliament. And so there was a meeting there in the middle of the 13th century at Oxford, and the king agreed that there'd be 3 parliaments every year where they could debate what was going on in the country. And then it was decided then that the king cannot act without the authority of appointed advisors. So people didn't like the fact the king thought, I have the authority to make all the decisions by myself. And so, you know, he made some good decisions, but also made some terrible decisions. But the point was, he was just exercising absolute authority. Can you mute whoever that is, please, Simi? So here then the parliament said, okay, to the king, you cannot act without the authority of appointed advisors. In other words, before you make a decision, you have to listen to advisors that we are appointing. You can't choose your own advisors. We're going to appoint advisors, and you have to listen to them before you make any decisions. And then not long after that, there was the first House of Commons. So before this is the House of Lords, with the earls and the dukes and everybody, the aristocrats. And they were the ones who, you know, trying to constrain the authority and power of the king. But then they decided, okay, we need to involve more of the people. So this became the House of Commons, where more people were invited. And so you had 2 houses, the House of Commons, the House of Lords. And then you had the first complete parliament where everybody met together. And that was Edward I. He called the first complete parliament. And he said the reason for doing this, he said, it's right that what concerned all should be approved by all. So he realized then you can't just make decisions by himself if it's going to affect the whole country. Everybody, you have to govern with consent, which means everybody has to have a say and everybody has to be involved in approving it. So that was, again, a very important principle here. Again, it's all going back to trying to recover the sort of biblical tradition, which is where a lot of this inspiration came from. Right, what concerned all should be approved by all. Then here, 1376, the right of the Commons to impeach any servant of the crown who'd done something wrong. So this meant the king and the king's servants also had to be under the law. The kings hate to be under the law. They want to be able to free to do whatever they want and to ignore the law. Well, there's this pushback with the Magna Carta and with one thing after another to force the king to abide by the law as well. So here, any of the king's servants then could be impeached and tried if they broke the law. And then it was decided both houses of parliament were necessary if they wanted to change the law. Nobody had the authority to change the law by themselves. There had to be the whole of parliament, which represented the whole people in order to be able to change the law. This is Simon de Montfort here. He is the one who called this first House of Commons. Got to mention him. Anyway, so things are developing, and then you had Henry VIII come to the throne. He had certain issues and with the Pope about who's going to be heir to the throne of England. And so he decided to take England away from the authority of the Pope in Rome. And so in 1534, the authority of the Pope in England ended, and England then became an entirely self-governing country. He changed the head of the church, so it's no longer part of the Roman Catholic Church. It then became an independent church, the Church of England. Then its daughter Elizabeth created some kind of Elizabethan settlement to try to incorporate everybody into this new body, the Church of England, because there's a lot of conflict, a lot of religious conflict at this time, and a lot of religious divisions. Then 1603, the union of the English and Scottish crowns. This is James VI of Scotland, and who became James I of England. So the King of Scotland was invited to become the King of England and Scotland. 17th century, there was a huge, so you had this religious divisions here between between Anglicans and Catholics. And then some of the people in the Church of England who were Protestants, they went off to Switzerland, they became Calvinists, became radicalized. And so you had a lot of people who were non-conformists. They refused to conform to the Anglican way of doing things. And they decided, instead of having priests and bishops appointed, they decided they wanted to elect their own ministers. And so beginnings of democracy within the religious sphere started here, when you had congregations decided, we don't want the priests who you say we should have, we want to elect our own minister to serve our own congregation. And so democracy then developed very, very much within these independent churches. So a lot of the controversy here, the Pilgrim Fathers decided they didn't have patience with it, so they went off to America. That was because these people here, the Pilgrim Fathers, the Puritans, they wanted to get rid of bishops. And James I said, no bishop, no king. Okay, so it wouldn't get rid of the bishops, and they wanted no bishops. They wanted a Presbyterian system in the Church of England. So they went off there, but not long after, Parliament asserted its right to control its own elections, again, taking control away from the king. And its privileges are of right and not grace. In other words, their privileges are not ones that have been granted by the king, but they have them of right. Declaration by the Commons that their privileges were not the gift of the crown, but the natural birthright of Englishmen, going, again, recovering the old Anglo-Saxon tradition. They could discuss matters of public interest, and they had the right to liberty of speech. So they could criticize the king and say whatever they liked about the king, and the king did not have the right to shut them up or to lock them up, put them in prison, let alone kill them. And then there was a petition of rights. No man could be taxed without consent. That went over to America. No taxation without representation. And no subject could be imprisoned without a just cause, such as the restatement of Magna Carta. So continually having to try and recover and restate and push back against the authoritarianism. There's a national covenant in Scotland. They decided they didn't want any popery being imposed on them from England by the English king. And then there's the abolition of the Star Chamber, which is where the king set up this alternative legal system where he could have people tried without a jury. So that obviously annoyed people, and that was abolished. And then Charles I, he didn't like this because he thought he had the divine right. Anyway, he believed he ruled by divine right, so he could do whatever he wanted. He didn't have to pay any attention to Parliament. He wanted to be able to raise taxes by himself, but he couldn't do that without Parliament. Anyway, so he had his head cut off. And you had the English Civil War, Commonwealth, a huge amount of social disorder, and with this social disorder led to a huge amount of religious pluralism, Quakers and all kinds of weird and wonderful sects and cults and spiritual groups developed, completely out of control of anybody. There were lots of political debates. And then in this confusion, Oliver Cromwell came along and he became the dictator because he realized he needed to restore some order here. When Cromwell died, basically it's a military dictatorship. When he died, his son didn't want the job. And so the king was invited back, restoration of monarchy. Again, various principles established, a habeas corpus. You know, you can't go and imprison people without them breaking the law. Then you had another king come along. I can't remember which one it was now. He also wanted to try and push back and re-establish monarchical authority and become autocratic again. And so people didn't like that. So there was a glorious revolution where William and Mary were invited over and to protect English liberties, and they became king and queen. But as a result of that, Parliament took the opportunity there to not only have an act of toleration for religious toleration, but also a declaration of right, so limiting the power of the king. So it's illegal to suspend law, tax without permission of Parliament. So again, limiting the powers of the king again and again, trying to, separate the authority of the king from the authority of the Parliament and the authority of the judiciary. Then English and Scottish parliaments were united. Interesting way. Scotland kept its own church, its own legal and educational system, its own currency. So even though it's in the United Kingdom, actually Scotland continued a lot of its own traditions and customs and legal systems and things until today, in many ways. So carrying on, those English people went over to America. They got a bit, wanted to do things differently, declared independence, and then this we the people. So again, trying to find out where's the source of authority for government, for decisions, for laws. It's we the people. Yeah. And then 19th, 20th century, a lot of reform acts to expand the franchise so more and more people could be involved. So during this time also, I didn't look at the intellectual development in England at all through the empirical tradition. I haven't got time for that. Maybe one of the most remarkable things that did happen was the Industrial Revolution, which transformed the entire world. So it started in England, and started in the north of England, northwest of England, Telford, Shropshire. And as it says here, the Industrial Revolution, the most important event in the history of humanity since the domestication of animals and plants. So that domestication of animal and plants is about 10,000 years ago. So if you look at the population of the world for the last 10,000 years, for about 10,000 years it is basically stable. Yeah. You look at the graph, it sort of wiggles up and down a bit, but basically it's stable. And then suddenly you see this exponential growth just in the last couple of hundred years. And you might wonder what happened then? Why did the population expand so rapidly? As this Nobel Prize winner says here, for the first time in history, the living standards of the masses of ordinary people have begun to undergo sustained growth. Nothing remotely like this economic behavior has ever happened before. So again, in the past, there were just a few rich people who lived a life of luxury, but for everybody else, life for thousands upon thousands of years, their standard of living didn't really change very, very much until the last couple of hundred years, and everything took off. So this industrial revolution started in England. Why did it start in England? Nowhere else. Well, basically, as a result of this political struggle, this process that I've been telling you about, what was established in England was this. First of all, there's freedom of religion. Yeah. From the 16th century, and especially from the 17th century, there's complete freedom of religion. And the people could believe whatever they wanted to believe. They could believe in God or not believe in God. They could be a Catholic, a Protestant, an Anglican, a Quaker, Presbyterian, and there's hundreds of weird, funny little groups that people signed up to during this period in the 17th century of social disorder. So with this freedom of religion then came freedom of speech. People could argue about anything, could hold any opinion they wanted. When they had the Putney debates, it was the most extraordinary kind of conversation debates they were having. Nothing like it until the founding fathers of America started talking about politics. With freedom of speech then comes freedom of ideas, and also literacy, because the Bible was translated into English. So people were able to debate the Bible, freedom of ideas, and along with freedom of ideas means the freedom to be creative. And also with this, the free press. So lots of pamphlets published arguing about all sorts of different matters, religious matters, political matters, all sorts of things. There's complete freedom of the press. The king hated it, but couldn't do anything about it. There were lots of journals, and scientific journals were established and all sorts of things like that. So with this then, you had this opportunity for people to be creative. They didn't have to worry about being arrested and tried for heresy and put into prison. Nobody could put them into prison because they had the wrong ideas or said the wrong thing. Of course, the government tried, but generally speaking, there was this freedom. At the same time, the development of the rule of law, this was from the Magna Carta, re-establishing the rule of law, that people could not be put into prison unless they broke the law. And the king couldn't decide what the law was, and the king couldn't decide who'd broken the law. It was the rule of law. With the rule of law then came freedom of association. People could meet with whoever they wanted to meet with, and could form groups. They didn't need to ask anybody's permission to meet with anybody else. And with this also came the right development of democracy, which I talked about. So people didn't need to ask permission from the state to do something. If people wanted to establish a chess club, they could do it without the permission of the state. If people wanted to start a new church, they didn't have to ask anybody's permission. until today. Sometimes people say, is the Unification Church registered in Britain? And I always say no. And they're always surprised. I said, we can't register. No church is registered. It's a free country. If you want to form your own church, you just form your church. You give it a name, you open a bank account, and that's it. You don't have to ask anybody permission to do anything. It's a free country. And so here it's the idea that the law then, and not the state, is a source of legitimate authority. Again, going back to this biblical tradition. And they had justice with an independent judiciary, which again pretty much exists until today, where only started having a Ministry of Justice in the last few years to conform to the European model. But there's an completely independent judiciary, and still today you cannot bribe an English judge. The government cannot tell an English judge what the correct verdict is. Yeah, that's still the way it is today. And then another aspect was property ownership. People, again, going back to the Anglo-Saxon way, although the crown still today owns everything formally, actually in reality people can own their own houses, they can own their own businesses, they can own their own property. And it's safe and secure. Generally speaking, if someone comes and steals something, they get arrested and put in prison. Historically, it doesn't happen much today. Most burglars aren't arrested and put in prison. Anyway, traditionally there were. And so people felt safe. Yeah. So, if you go to England, you find very, very rarely do you ever find any houses which have got bars on the windows or anything like that. Anybody could just break in easily. But generally speaking, people don't. There's a respect for property ownership. And you're protected by the law and also the free market. So this means that people were free to have all these ideas. Then they could invent whatever they wanted to invent. Then they could go and make it without asking anybody's permission to set up their own factory and start making stuff. And then they could sell it to whoever wanted to buy it without asking anybody's permission. So it's this which enabled the possibility of the Industrial Revolution, not because the English are particularly creative or anything, it's just because they've managed to create a society which is based upon the three blessings. Yeah. Which is heart, logos, and creativity. And so basically this is it. Yeah, this is a society based upon the three blessings, which enabled all this creativity to develop and then to be spread all over the rest of the world. And so that's why the whole world then has enjoyed this incredible uptick in standard of living and population and everything else like that. Okay, so as I said, there's continuous struggle how to create a framework, a society which is based upon the three blessings, in which people have the freedom to be able to realize the three blessings, and beauty, truth, and goodness. And these are basically, I would say, basic requirements, really. Okay, so in the principle it says, where will the ideology essential to the establishment of a new world come from? This ideology must arise out of the democratic world, which is rooted in the able-type view of life. Nevertheless, it is a fact of history that no conventional ideology among those prevailing in the democratic world can effectively defeat communist ideology. Therefore, a hitherto unknown ideology will emerge from within the democratic world, and this truth is the essence of the able-type view of life and the core of democracy. So the principle then, the ideology or the political philosophy that is going to be the basis for the new world to come is going to be grounded in the essence of the able-type view of life, which is the core of which is democracy. And as I said, looking at the last few days, the core of that is in itself the biblical political philosophy, how to create a framework for people to be able to be free to pursue the beauty, truth, and goodness, free to be able to realize the three blessings, free to be able to worship God how they want to worship God, free to be able to form families, societies, communities in which they're protected by the law. And so, yeah, there was a long struggle anyway. So where does it come from? Well, I would say, having come across Friedrich Hayek, because as I said, he received the Founders Award from Father many, many years ago. And so because he got the Founders Award from Father, I thought, well, that's an interesting person. I wonder what he has to say for himself. And so the first book I read was this one here, Road to Serfdom. I recommend everybody reads it. It's not very long, and it's really concise, and it's really powerful exposition of this kind of approach. And it was very, very shocking actually. When it was published, it shocked a lot of people because it was a very different way of looking at political philosophy. And then he wrote this book, and this one here is hard work, but it's also really important, actually. So he said some good things, really good things, very, very sharp things. And we read them, you think, oh, when I read this, I thought, wow, this is the principle. You know, somebody had actually invested in trying to translate the principle into political and social and economic philosophy. This is what it would look like. So this is one, for example, this is just one one phrase, paragraph from The Road to Serfdom. It says, freedom to order our own conduct in the sphere where material circumstances force a choice upon us, and the responsibility for the arrangement of our own life, according to our own conscience, is the air in which alone moral sense grows, and in which moral values are daily recreated in the free decisions of the individuals. Responsibility, not to a superior, but to one's own conscience. The awareness of a duty not exacted by compulsion, force, the necessity to decide which of the things one values are to be sacrificed to others and to bear the consequences of one's own decision are the very essence of any morals which deserve the name. So you can see here, well, this just resonates so much with the language and the philosophy of the principle. And as I said, it's well worth reading. A very, very powerful book. And yeah, he talks all about freedom, responsibility, can't have one without the other, the role of law, conscience, the moral life, and he recognized the grounding of the moral life in what, you know, his humanistic understanding we call the three blessings. And so he's trying to persuade people to take up this challenge. And that's why he was so attracted towards Father and what Father was doing, this victory over communism work and science conferences and everything. So again, this is Hayek. He said, we must make the building of a free society once more an intellectual adventure, a deed of courage. Unless we can make the philosophical foundations of a free society once more a living intellectual issue, and its implementation a task which challenges the ingenuity and imagination of our liveliest minds, the prospect of freedom are indeed dark. But if we can regain that belief in the power of ideas, which is a mark of liberalism at its best, the battle is not lost. So you can see here, he is calling for exactly what the principle itself is calling for, the re-emergence of a new able type way of thinking, which is grounded in what we would say is a principle, but certainly grounded in the biblical tradition, biblical understanding. And it's very, very powerful. And so he started writing basically in the 1930s, and his ideas formed the basic for the fight against communism. We did a lot of VOC work, but you might wonder what other people doing. So what were Reagan, Thatcher, and all these people, whose ideas inspired them? It's actually Friedrich Hayek. Whose ideas motivated the tremendous changes which took place in Eastern Europe? It was Friedrich Hayek. Yeah. So it's well worth reading. Anyway, there are lots of problems with democracy. Huge problems. Winston Churchill said, democracy is the worst system of government apart from all the other ones. And the reason is very simple. It's a problem that appeared way back when in the Greeks. It's about law and the authority to make law. So Socrates then, he became the lone opponent of an illegal proposal to try a group of Athens' top generals for failing to recover their dead from the battle against Sparta. So this is during the democratic phase in Athens, and the people who were in the Senate, it was in those days, or anyway, whatever it was called, I can't remember now. Anyway, so there was a battle, and Athens' top generals had made a mistake. And so what the government wanted to do, they wanted to punish them, even though they hadn't broken any laws. Yeah. So Socrates objected, say you can't punish people if they haven't broken a law. Yeah. And so he objected to that. 3 years later, when a tyrannical Athenian government ordered Socrates to participate in the arrest and execution of Leonos Salamis, he refused. An act of civil disobedience of Martin Luther King would cite his letter to Birmingham jail. So here, does the majority then, does a democratically elected majority have the authority to act illegally? So some people would say, yes, it's the will of the majority, therefore it should happen even if it's against the law. That's the problem with democracy, the key problem. Does a majority have the right to change the rules of just conduct? Just because the majority of one particular political party has won the election, has formed a majority in parliament or whatever, does that mean they have absolute authority to change the law and to change the rules of just conduct? Does the majority have the right to impose its will on a minority? These are the kind of problems. And so the biblical solution to that, because when it goes like that, the majority rules, then you end up with totalitarianism. You end up with political correctness. Somebody in a minority no longer has any rights, is no longer protected by the law, and it becomes inherently totalitarian. So this is the thing. That's why the biblical tradition is always emphasizing the law. You may hate that person, but that person is protected by the law. There may be 99% of the population of the country may disagree with this person, but they still have the right to say what they want to say, believe what they want to believe, and to travel where they want to travel. Yeah, the law is there to protect. And then the question is, does the majority have the right to change the law? Well, the biblical tradition would be no. The majority is be confined. And so this is a debate that went on in Greece then. What asks a teenage Alcibiades, pseudo-innocently, is law? He's asking a question to Pericles, who was the greatest orator of his time. Why, answers his guardian Pericles, who was then at the height of his influence. The law is whatever the people decides and decrees. What, replies Alcibiades? Even when it decrees by fiat, acting like a tyrant and riding roughshod over the views of the minority, is that still law? Certainly, says Pericles. So, persists Alcibiades, democracy is really just another form of tyranny. And that's always the issue. Yeah. So does a democratically elected government have the authority to change the laws on marriage, for example? So we looked at that when I discussed this issue of gay marriage. Yeah, the origins of marriage marriage was, as an institution, was not created by the state. It was not created by the government. It was not created by religion. It's a natural institution. So does a democratically elected government actually have the authority to change it? No, would be the traditional biblical answer. Yeah. Yes, would say Pericles. Yeah, that's how you end up with tyranny. Okay, so I'm going to finish that one. I'm going to now move on to the next topic. See if I can find it. I'll stop share that and share something else. Okay. Sorry about this. That one. Okay. Slideshare, play from start. Okay, so I want to start looking a little bit then at a principal view of economics. Anyway, these are all, as I said, this is an experimental workshop. I'm just exploring these things, trying to join the dots myself, trying to see how does these things connect with each other. And who's this? I think this is Hayek again, yeah. So to understand our civilization, one must appreciate that the extended order, so when it says here extended order, so what we're talking about here is the society in which we live. It's like an extended order. The society in which we live is very orderly and it's very extended. It's not like just limited to our family. We have order in our family, order in our local community. It's an extended order, a whole society, the whole economy. This is the extended order. And when you look at it, it's quite orderly. People go, shops open, people go shopping, people buy and sell. You know, when you actually stand there and watch what's going on, it's very, very orderly. Yeah, it's like the extended order. So this extended order resulted not from human design or intention, but spontaneously. So again, we're going all the way back here to The Secret Life of Chaos. This incredibly complex order, which we see in our society, which we see in our economy, is not the result of human design or intention, but it just emerges spontaneously through people making lots of decisions and taking all these other people's decisions into account. And as the circumstances change, they can continue adjusting to each other. It arose from unintentionally conforming to certain traditional and largely moral practices, such as do not steal or do not kill, many of which men tend to dislike. Some people like stealing and beating others up, whose significance they usually fail to understand, whose validity they cannot prove, and which have nonetheless fairly rapidly spread by means of an evolutionary selection, the comparative increase of population and wealth of those groups that happen to follow them. So here's the idea that that there is evolution within societies. It's possible to pass on knowledge, customs, skills, traditions from one generation to the next. So it's possible for the next generation to be more educated, more cultured, more capable than the previous one. That's one thing. The second thing is some countries, they have different kinds of rules. And when each country is following its own rules, you can see some rules are better than other rules. And so again, you have some societies which emerge, become more wealthy and more prosperous because they have some sets of rules, whereas other societies have got different rules, a different kind of structure, they do less well. So you can see that's the sort of idea here. The main idea here is this extended order is not the result of human design, but arises spontaneously. So this is the ongoing theme which I'm really interested in. So I've forgotten most stuff, to be honest. Okay, so the person who first developed this idea, who thought about this, was an empiricist called David Hume. Now, the empirical tradition is you look at how do things work from experience. Knowledge comes from experience, not from reason. And one of Hume's most important sayings was, the rules of morality are not the product of our reason. Yeah, the rules of morality are not the functional, not the product of our reason. So he's watching, he's observing, he's an empiricist, how do things work? And so he sought to describe the way that society works, not based upon reason, but just upon describing it. And so this is how he described it, looking at how things are. He said, when every individual person labors alone, and only for himself, his capacity is too small to accomplish very much. In other words, if you have to grow all your own food, make all your own clothes and shoes and everything, you can't do very much. You can't accomplish very much. Basically, you're just living in a very low standard of living in many ways. His labor has to supply all his different needs. So society provides a solution to this problem. By society means working together or living together with other people. So he says this is none other than the natural attraction and love between the sexes, which unites them together. So he says people, man and woman, two people, one man, one woman, they're attracted to each other, and also they love each other, and this is what unites them with each other. And this preserves their union, what we call marriage, until a new tie takes place when they have kids and their love for their children. So what do we got? What are we talking about here? 4 great realms of heart, yeah, a family. This new concern also unites the parents and offspring and forms a more numerous society, a family. So when a man and a woman are working together, they become partners. And if you're working together with someone, you have a partner you're working with, you love this person, you can grow more together. You can do more together when you're working with somebody. If you want to build a house, it's easier to build a house with somebody else than to just have to do it all by yourself. And so that's why people do better when they've got somebody else, they're not alone. And then when you have a family and you've got 6 kids, then you can send them all out in the fields to dig the ground and plant the potatoes. And again, etc., etc., you become more wealthy and more prosperous. So he said the family then is the basis of everything. The parents governed by the advantage of their superior strength. So, yep, we all know about that, and wisdom. And at the same time are restrained in the exercise of their authority by the natural affection which they have for their children. Yeah, so you may get upset with your children. Generally speaking, people don't beat their children up because they love them. In time, custom and habit make the children aware of the advantages they may reap from society as well as the fashions them for it. So the family then equips people to live within society. As Father said, the family is a school of love. within the family, you learn how to form relationships with people older than you, younger than you, the same age as you, etc., etc. So what David Hume is describing here is the family as a principle. He himself was, he's a skeptic anyway. So what does it say in the principle? So we looked at this, if you remember. The human mind imparts to every person a natural inclination to join with others in harmony. That's basically what David Hume is saying. People are attracted to each other. A man is attracted to a woman, as Father endlessly went on about, and they get married, they love each other, they have children, creates a family, they want to relate with other families, cousins, uncles, aunts, etc. And so I explained about this. It's all going bottom up. Man, woman, it says in the principle, family, two families interrelate with each other, they form a group, groups interrelate with each other, form a tribe, and then, got the wrong order here, then tribes interrelate with each other, form a society. This is the great society in which most people don't know each other. Up to a tribal level, you can know most people, or you can at least know everybody's relative. When you get to this level here, most people you actually don't know, yeah, but you still treat them with respect. You know, most of the people you pass by in the street, you don't know them, but you treat them with respect, and you expect they will treat you with respect, and you know, very little violence actually goes on. And then societies interact, you get a nation, nations interact, you get a world. Okay, so this is the principle view. It's all bottom up, yeah, guided by the universal prime force, which is driving, as we talked about before, to greater and greater levels of complexity, and it all happens very, very spontaneously. Very, very naturally. This is what happens, the way the world works. And so, just briefly, as we know, this is from a principle point of view, family is a dwelling place for God, family that prays together, as my wife always tells me, stays together. Spiritual life creates hope for the future. Marriage is an act of faith, hope, and love. It creates a sense of meaning, a reason to live and to multiply, etc., etc. And then it's a place for love, different relationships, and transmission of culture and the good way of life from generation to generation. And the family people are socialized into how to behave within their own community and their own country. And also the family then is often the basis for an economy. People often work together to create wealth, to support the family and community, and develop a sense of ownership. This is our house, we own it. This is our garden, we own it. This is our business, we own it. And we want to look after it and develop it. So people have a chance to develop, realize creativity. And so there are many family businesses where get passed on from generation to generation. It also develops a culture of giving and sharing. But as David Hume said, societies are more than, although the family is the basis of society, he said, families are more than just societies. Societies are more than just families. You also have social structures and institutions. So he makes a clear distinction between the family and society. So he said the family is based on love and forgiveness. You have to love your kids endlessly, and you have to forgive them endlessly. You have to love your brothers and sisters, and you have to forgive them over and over again. Yeah, you have to just keep doing that. Yeah, society though is based on justice. Yeah, not on love and forgiveness. Yeah, if your brother or your sister breaks your toy, you don't say, well, I'm going to go and prosecute you for that and expect you to be punished. It's, oh, I'm sorry, okay, I'll forgive you. But society is based on justice, has to be. So when somebody goes and steals something, you're not going to say, oh, I forgive you for stealing. You expect, actually, they should be punished to uphold the law and justice. So there's two important distinctions there. Family is based on love and forgiveness, society is based upon justice, which is an eye for an eye, an appropriate level of punishment for the crime that a person has committed. And then again, if you have affection in social relations, it leads to corruption. So if you can get a job, oh, I can get a job because my uncle, he works in that company, or my uncle, he's a member of parliament, so it's possible for me to get a good job. That's called corruption or nepotism, when you can achieve a good job or get this or get that or the other, or contract just because your brother or your cousin, your uncle happens to work in a particular government office or something like that. That's corruption. At the same time, so there has to be justice, has to be according to the law. At the same time, if legalism affects family relationships, it destroys it. Yeah. If you can't forgive and endlessly forgive and love, you just want legality, then the family will break up. So it's a different kind of basis, David Hume said. Okay, then he recognized another reality. He said, we need goods, we need things, carrots, apples, bananas, leather, sheep, coal, whatever. We need goods, but there are not enough of them to supply everyone's desires and necessities. In other words, there's always a shortage of things. There's always a shortage of things. And then the question is, well, how do we decide who gets what? So as an improvement to the availability of these goods is a chief advantage of society, so the instability of their possession, along with their scarcity, is a chief impediment. So you may have something, but then you may be worried that somebody will come along and steal it. So you feel, I don't feel secure in my ownership of my car, my bicycle, or my apple tree, or whatever. Along with scarcity, so if there's a shortage of coal, then that's a problem. Yeah. So, as David Hume said, our strongest attention is to ourselves. So, we're very concerned to make sure we're well fed and looked after. Our next is extended to our family. So the next, we look after our husband and wife, our children, and then, okay, they're all fed, they're all watered, they're all well looked after. And then we think about our relatives, brothers and sisters, cousins, uncles, aunts, And then after that, we extend to our friends, and then after that to our acquaintances. And it's only the weakest which reaches to the strangers and indifferent persons. So if you can see two people in trouble, one is your family member and one is a complete stranger, your obligation and your duty is to take care of your family member before you take care of a stranger. That's a basic moral principle. Goes all the way back to the Bible and Confucius as well. This partiality then, and unequal affection, means we love some people more than we love others. That's just the way it is. So David Hume is not saying it should be different than the way it is. He's saying he's an empiricist. This is the way it is. People love those who are closest to them more than people who are distant from them. And there's a sort of spectrum, a gradation. Yeah. And so this, he said, influences our behavior in society, our ideas of what is good and what is bad. So he said, we disapprove of a person who either centers all his affections on his family or is so neglectful of his family that he gives preference to strangers. Yeah. So we think that's a funny thing to do. You don't take care of your children and your own family, you neglect them, but you're really concerned about taking care of strangers in other parts of the world. So that's David Hume's observation about morality and how it works. So as he said, family expands to become a small society, affection declines as distance increases, then there's a scarcity of goods. There's not enough stuff to go around. There's not enough apples growing on the trees. There's not enough bananas. There's not enough fish in the river, etc. There's a scarcity. And so selfishness creates limitation to our generosity. At the same time, there's a scarcity of desirable goods. And so the result of this can very easily be destructive conflict. People can say, okay, there's only one apple tree, and people can fight over who's going to get access to the apples, or who's going to get access to a particular river for fishing, or who's going to get access to those particular sheep or hunting in this particular area. So sometimes there's a destructive conflict over access to fishing grounds, hunting grounds, all these sorts of things. We see it in the newspapers from time to time. So in that case, he realized you need to have a framework of commonly accepted rules. Otherwise, there's just going to be conflict. So you need to have commonly accepted rules or laws to prevent this kind of conflict from taking place. So David Hume then, he analyzed and said there are three principles of justice. So he said people naturally share what they have with the family, for whom they have the natural affection. Scarcity, though, leads to envy and conflict. That's why the 10th commandment is do not envy, do not covet. Leads to conflict. People want things for themselves and their family. But at the same time, everybody wants to be left undisturbed in the enjoyment of his proper possessions. So everybody wants things, but at the same time, they don't want anybody else to take those things away from them. So people want to own, not merely possess goods. They want to have a sense, this is mine. I have a right to it. I don't just want to possess it, at the moment, and somebody else can come along and possess it later because nobody owns anything. So he said people want to own, not merely possess goods. So the first principle, he said, is every man, no matter how we happen to feel about him, we may like him or hate him, should be left undisturbed in the enjoyment of his proper possessions develops. So this rule develops, yeah, and it's followed because people believe it to be useful. So the rule is here, you don't steal things that belong to somebody else. Someone has something, some possessions, you just let them enjoy their possessions and you don't disturb their enjoyment of those possessions. You certainly don't steal them. So people believe it to be useful. Why do they believe it to be useful? They know their own desires, and through feeling sympathy for others, extrapolate everyone feels the same way. So again, it's a biblical understanding here of compassion. As it said in the Bible, God said to the people of Israel, don't mistreat a stranger because you were strangers once in Egypt. You know what it's like to be mistreated, so don't mistreat others. That understanding of compassion, treat others as you'd have them treat you. So he said, based upon this understanding of sympathy, we can imagine, I don't want someone to steal my stuff. I can imagine other people feel exactly the same way about their stuff. So let's have a rule. You don't steal my stuff and I won't steal your stuff. And if everybody follows this rule, then there's no conflict. There's no destructive conflicts and arguments. Yeah. And again, it's based upon sympathy. It's not rational. It's just grounded in human nature. Through this ownership relationship exists, not just between the person and the thing, but also between people, because that ownership is acknowledged. Property ownership then is a social construct. Everybody acknowledges that different things belong to different people and you aren't going to go and steal it. So ownership is defined relationally. Yeah. So the principle also is about a relationship between a subject and object. Yeah, defines that. It's an artificial social convention. But once everything is owned by somebody, the contention, the argument is stopped, as long as everyone abides by this convention. So as long as everything is owned by somebody and everybody follows the rule not to steal, then there's no more arguments about anything, because people aren't fighting and arguing about an apple tree, because everybody knows this apple tree belongs to this particular person and whose garden it is. Yeah, as long as every piece of land is owned by somebody, then there's no more arguments and fights about who's able to possess it and use it. The benefit of the institution of property is that the short-term outlook of most people is replaced by a long-term view. So if you know that you can enjoy the fruit of planting apple trees, then you're going to take a long-term view and you think it's worth planting them. If on the other hand you can't, because you're worried somebody's just going to go and steal your apples, what's the point in agriculture? What's the point in planting apple trees? What's the point in building anything if somebody can just come along and steal it? Yeah? So this then leads to a long-term view. Also, you realize you can pass things on to your descendants, as is their natural inclination. They're more likely to be industrious and frugal. So if you can pass things on to your descendants, to your children and grandchildren, then you're less likely to spend all the money on yourself. But if you can't pass anything on to your children and grandchildren, you think, well, I might as well enjoy it all myself and just lead a life of luxury. But, I know that my grandparents and people, they realized they wanted to pass stuff on to their children and to my generation. So they're very, very careful not to waste money, not to spend money unnecessarily, so they could pass it on and build up the lineage in terms of the next generation being in a better situation than the present generation. So this then is this idea of property, respect for ownership. It's really the fundamental. And so when we think about communism, what is communism then? The essence of communism, said Marx and Engels in the Communist Manifesto in 1948, communism is the abolition of private property. That's the essence of communism, abolition of private property. So that means there's no private property. That means the state owns everything and the state controls everything. Yeah. There are no free markets because of planned economy. State and the party control the creative arts. So this means that if the state owns everything, it means you cannot become a true owner. If the state owns everything, it means it's impossible to fulfill the purpose of creation. It's impossible to fulfill the third blessing and become the Lord of creation if the state owns everything. can't become the Lord of creation, cannot become a true owner, and you cannot inherit God's creativity, because you can't decide to redecorate your house or to build something here and do this or that to your land, because it's not your land. So you have to ask permission from somebody before you can do anything. And this is a core knowledge, private property and freedom. This is Leon Trotsky, great hero for many of the people on the left these days. So he said, during the purges of the last month of 1935, this is in the Soviet Union, when Stalin was establishing his control, and the first half of 1936, hundreds of thousands of members of the party were again expelled and among them several tens of thousands of Trotskyists, because they are people who perceived not to be loyal to Stalin, but to be loyal to Trotsky. The most active were immediately arrested and thrown into prisons and concentration camps. As for the rest, Stalin, through Pravda, which was the state newspaper telling the truth, openly advised local organs not to give them work. In a country where the sole employer is the state, this means death by slow starvation. The old principle, who does not work shall not eat, had been replaced by a new one, who does not obey shall not eat. So that's the way it works. When the state owns everything, controls everything, it means if you annoy some bureaucrat or party member, you can lose your job. If you lose your job, you can't find employment anywhere else. You certainly can't start your own business. And so you either shut up and do as you're told, or you die. And that's the way it is. Property is necessary for freedom. It's a guarantor of freedom. So the second rule, which David Hume identified, he said, however, it's not enough for people to have stability of possession. Since people have different goods, there has to be a way for people to be able to exchange their property. The second principle is therefore the convention that rights over goods may be transferred by consent, and only by consent. This means that the consequent This means the consequent division of labor becomes possible, so that goods can be produced which are available to all. So this is the idea, okay, I've got a garden and I'm really good at growing potatoes, but I don't really want to live on just potatoes. I'd really like to have a bit of lamb, but I can't grow sheep in my garden. So here's the second principle. It's possible for me to transfer and exchange my potatoes for your lamb. That means these potatoes no longer belong to me, they now belong to you. And that lamb no longer belongs to you, it belongs to me. Again, second principle, the right of ownership can be transferred to somebody else, but only by consent. Yeah, really important. So that means you can transfer by giving and sharing. Yeah, you can either give something to somebody, you can give somebody a lamb or potatoes or fish or apples that you've been growing, or if you want to, you can share them around, or you can transfer them by exchange. You can do bartering and swapping apples for tomatoes, or you can sell them. Yeah, but the important thing is there's no stealing, no fraud, and no robbery. It has to be by consent. And so, as he said, that means it's possible for people to specialize the division of labor. So you may be particularly good at growing potatoes, and somebody else is particularly good at growing tomatoes. So you can specialize in potatoes, they can specialize in tomatoes, and then you can exchange them. So you can have tomatoes to eat, and they can have potatoes to eat. So people can specialize in doing what they're good at doing, yeah? Whether it's growing or looking after animals, or particularly good at fishing. And then, of course, people may be particularly good at sewing, making clothes, making shoes. All this kind of division of labor happens and develops. And society then becomes far more complex. Yeah, but it's not because of a plan. It's just people realize, oh, I can specialize now. And then society becomes much more complex, unbelievably complex because of this. Yeah. And then, okay, so how do you exchange these things? Well, that's what the market is. The market is a place which is a convenient, usually by a river crossing or where roads cross, where there's lots of people going to and fro. So you take your sheep or your tomatoes or your apples there and you sell them. And lots of people take things to buy and sell there because they know there's going to be lots of customers there. And that's what a market is, just a place where people can buy and sell. But a free market is one where everybody is free to buy and sell. So anybody can go there and sell. Nobody has a monopoly on selling tomatoes or monopoly on selling apples. Anybody can go and sell their apples there, and anybody can go and buy from whoever they want to buy. And then you have the price, which I'll talk about later, is established there. And since it's rather inconvenient to do barter, then that's why money developed. It's just a convenient unit of exchange, just makes, exchange much more convenient. And so that's that's the second principle. Anyway, if you have in a communist society where there's no private property, there's no market. So what do? Then you have to have planning, central planning. So this is Hayek's comment on this alternative, which is under communism. The reasons why the adoption of a system of central planning necessarily produces a totalitarian system are fairly simple. Whoever controls the means of production must decide which ends they're to serve. In other words, what this particular factory is going to make. As under modern conditions, control of economic activity means control of the material means for practically all our ends. It means control over nearly all our activities. The nature of the detailed scale of values which must guide the planning makes it impossible that it should be determined by anything like democratic means. The director of the planned system would have to impose his scale of values, his hierarchy of ends, which, if it is to be sufficient to determine the plan, must include a definite order of rank in which the status of each person is laid down. If the plan is to succeed, or the planner to appear successful, the people must be made to believe that the objectives chosen are the right ones. Every criticism of the plan or the ideology underlying it must be treated as sabotage. Very common word in communist countries. There can be no freedom of thought, no freedom of the press, where it is necessary that everything should be governed by a single system of thought. In theory, socialism may wish to enhance freedom, but in practice, every kind of collectivism consistently carried through must produce the characteristic features which fascism, Nazism, and communism have in common. Totalitarianism is nothing but consistent collectivism, the ruthless execution of the principle that the whole comes before the individual and the direction of all members of society by a single will, supposedly to represent the whole. There's a lot of that going on because there's no free market, so there's no spontaneous order, but people mutually adjust and cooperate with each other. Actually, everything is a result of a plan. Somebody has to make the plan. Someone has to decide the priorities and what's going to be produced in particular factories. So it's very undemocratic. It's all Plato again. The planner is the philosopher king who knows what's best for everybody else and certainly knows what's better for people than they know themselves. And again, Hume's third principle, he said, again, it's very inconvenient to have to barter and have simultaneous direct exchange of goods. So, for example, you might take your potatoes to the market, and really what you would like to have is, I don't know, something else which isn't going to be available for another 6 months. So one person's crops may be ripe in the spring. Oh yeah, you say he's better than me. One person's crops may be ripe in the spring and another's in the autumn. So the third principle is required: performance of promises. If people make promises which are directed towards some future performance, they should keep them. Otherwise, there can be no trust, no trade, and no society. So what he's saying here is you come along, you bring your potatoes to the market, and someone says, I would like to buy your potatoes, but my crop isn't going to be ripe until 3 months' time. Can you give me if you give me your potatoes today, in 3 months' time, I will give you whatever it is that I've been growing. Does that make sense? So it means you have to trust each other. That means you have to keep promises. So this is really important, promise keeping. So you have this saying, my word is my bond. It's not written down on paper. This is based on the City of London. Not written down on paper, you just trust people. They say they will pay you in 6 months, and then they do. And if they don't, of course, you never trust them again, and you never do business with them ever again. They get shut out of the business. Yeah. So again, This then enables people to trust strangers. So the way it works in the economy, you don't know everybody in the shops. People trust each other. It's a basic sense of trusting people unless you have a reason not to trust them. And then you start thinking twice. So you have free trade between strangers, pick up the phone, make a contract, and you expect the person will honor their contract. You've got no reason to expect they won't unless you have experience otherwise. And so this means it doesn't matter what someone's race, sex, religion, or politics are, it's just business. Buying and selling is just business. And so it's about promises. And again, this is when you have communism, it abolishes the first blessing. I haven't got time to go into all of this, but this is just Alexander Solzhenitsyn. In our country, the lie has become not just a moral category, but a pillar of the state. Yeah, not promising, not keeping your word, but actually something else. What's his name in The Captive Mind, an East European writer, I can't pronounce it, also explored this very, very well. You think one thing, you say another thing, and you do a third thing. Disunity of mind and body, based upon the lie. Can't trust anybody, which is why in communist countries you had to put endless numbers of stamps on pieces of paper in order to get permission to do anything. So there's no freedom of speech or religion, and suppression of that and that. Okay, so what David Hume is talking about here is he's discovered the three blessings. Not from the Bible. He wasn't particularly religious. He was an incredible skeptic. So he said, okay, the first one, he said, property. It means society is a society of owners. People own their own business, they own their own houses, they own their own shops, they own their own things that they manufacture and they produce. And this is having dominion of the creation, being a true owner. And the law here is do not steal, or Father said, do not misuse public money. Then also he's describing society as a market where people relate to each other and people encounter each other in the market, producers and consumers, buyers and sellers. And this is about ethical relationships. Father said don't have immoral sexual relations, but it's basically you treat people ethically. Yeah. And you don't lie to them, you don't cheat, you don't steal. It's ethics. And then also Hume said society is moral. This is the free market is moral because it's based upon mind-body unity, keeping promises. Yeah, so people have to be moral to be able to function in a free society. That's why it developed very, very much where people are living a spiritual life, living according to their conscience. Father said, don't hurt another person's heart. So that then becomes these three principles of justice, which David Hume said. It's the three blessings, and it's also the three laws, which you looked at before a few days ago. Okay, so that's the end of that. We'll look at that tomorrow about values and how the principal view of values and things like that. Okay, so I'm going to stop here. Shall we stop there? It's 8:05.
Yeah, it's just 5:15. I think that's a good place to close for today.
Anyway, so thank you all very much for turning up this evening. It's been really great looking at all your faces here and having this time to be able to share with you. And I didn't think I'd be able to get to the end of these 3 weeks, to be honest. But there's only one more day to go, and I realized, oh, maybe I should have added another week. But tomorrow will be the last day for now anyway. So anyway, do you want to wrap up there, Simi?
Yeah, thank you, Uncle William.
Thank you.
Really, really good. Okay, please join me in prayer, everyone. Good evening, Heavenly Parent and true parents. We just finished our penultimate session of joining the dots. It's been really interesting, and there's still lots to discuss and discover, and yeah, we're really grateful for this time. But we want to offer today's session to you now, and I want to offer this on behalf of everyone here. In my name, so my daughter of a blessed family, true